The dust rose in lazy spirals behind the stagecoach as it rolled to a stop in front of Willow Creek's general store. Margaret Sullivan clutched her worn carpet bag tighter and peered through the grimy window. The small frontier town beyond looked like a painting faded by sun and hardship. One crooked street lined with weathered buildings and a single sign creaking in the wind. At 43, with streaks of silver threading through her dark hair and grief carved gently around her green eyes, Margaret was far from the usual kind of settler heading west. Yet here she was, stepping down into the red dust of Texas, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral 8 months ago in Philadelphia. The driver's rough voice broke her thoughts. "End of the line, ma'am." Willow Creek Margaret nodded and climbed down, boots crunching on the hard earth. Dust clung to her skirt instantly, and the dry wind bit through her thin gloves. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Everything she owned fit into 2 carpet bags. A widow's life boiled down to fabric, letters, and one torn advertisement that had carried a fragile promise. Circle M Ranch seeks cook. Room and board provided. Inquire at Morrison's General Store, Willow Creek. She had read that line so many times that she could still see it, even when her eyes closed. The town itself was hardly more than a handful of buildings clinging together against the emptiness. A saloon called the Lucky Strike leaned toward the street, its porch crowded with men who looked half curious, half suspicious at the sight of a lone woman stepping off the stagecoach. Margaret straightened her shoulders, trying to ignore their stares, and walked toward the general store. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. Inside, the air smelled of flour, tobacco, and oil lamps. Behind the counter stood a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, scratching at a ledger. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Help you, ma'am. I'm inquiring about the cook's position at the Circle M Ranch." She held out the folded advertisement. The storekeeper, whom she guessed was Mr. Morrison, took the paper, squinting at it, before meeting her gaze. "That notice has been up for 2 months," he said carefully. "The Circle M's 20 miles out, rough country. Hard work, not exactly suitable for—" His glance swept over her black dress and polished shoes. "A lady like yourself," Margaret lifted her chin. "I assure you, Mr. Morrison, I'm quite capable of cooking." That was not entirely true. In Philadelphia, she'd had servants for that. But desperation has a way of teaching confidence. Mr. Morrison sighed and rubbed his jaw. "It ain't just the cooking, ma'am. The Circle M is a hard place. J. Caldwell runs it. Fair man, but no patience for foolishness. Only men out there. No families, no other women. You'd be the only one." "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm a widow, Mr. Morrison. I've no family, no income, and no other prospects. I need this job." Her voice didn't shake, though her heart did. Something in her calm tone must have reached him, because his expression softened. "Can you ride?" "Not well. Ever cooked over a wood stove?" "No. But I can learn." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "The supply wagon heads out tomorrow at dawn. You can ride with old Pete if you're set on it." "I'm certain," she said firmly. He hesitated, then added kindly, "There's a boarding house down the street. Mrs. Patterson runs it. Tell her I sent you. And ma'am," his gaze went to her black dress again, "you might want to buy something more practical. That city fabric won't last a week on a working ranch." Margaret looked down at the dusty hem and gave a faint smile. "Thank you for the advice." With the last of her money, she bought 2 calico dresses, a pair of sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to replace her bonnet. As Mr. Morrison wrapped her purchases, he asked, "What brings you this far west, if you don't mind me asking?" "My husband was a doctor in Philadelphia," she replied softly. "When he passed, I discovered he'd left me with nothing but debts. I sold what I could to pay them, and when I saw that advertisement, I thought perhaps—" She stopped herself. "Perhaps I could start again." "I'm sorry for your loss," Morrison said sincerely, "but cooking for ranch hands ain't easy. They eat like wolves and complain like children." Margaret's smile was small but steady. "I've managed society dinners with guests more demanding than wolves, Mr. Morrison." "I believe I'll manage," he chuckled. "You've got spirit, ma'am. Might be that's what Caldwell needs. But don't expect him to smile much. Man's as cold as a mountain winter." That evening, Margaret found a room at the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson, a small, sharp-eyed woman, eyed her curiously. "So you're the new cook for Jake Caldwell's outfit?" "I hope so," Margaret said. Mrs. Patterson sniffed. "Hope's a fine thing. You'll need it out there." Ranch like the Circle M can chew a person up if they ain't made of tough hide. When Margaret lay down that night, she could hardly sleep. The sounds outside, the clop of hooves, the faint music from the saloon, the faraway howl of something wild, were strange and uneasy companions. She held the folded advertisement in her hand, tracing the inked letters. This single piece of paper had carried her halfway across the country. Tomorrow she would ride 20 miles farther, into the wilderness to cook for men she'd never met and a boss known for silence. The thought should have terrified her, but instead, it filled her with a quiet determination. At dawn, she climbed onto the supply wagon beside old Pete, the driver. The road to the ranch was long and rough, but Margaret held on, clutching her bag and watching the land open wide around them. Golden prairie grass stretching forever, mountains rising blue in the distance. "That's the Circle M boundary," Pete said after hours of travel, pointing to a wooden gate marked with a blackened brand. Another 3 miles to the main house. Margaret's stomach fluttered. The ranch appeared suddenly, sprawling buildings of timber and stone huddled against the wind. It was larger than she expected, but carried a deep stillness, a kind of loneliness. Pete reined in the horses. "Wait here." "I'll fetch Jake." Margaret brushed dust from her dress, straightened her hat, and tried to steady her breath. When the front door opened, her heart gave a small, startled leap. Jake Caldwell was not the grizzled old rancher she'd imagined. He was tall, lean, perhaps in his late 30s, with sun-darkened skin and gray eyes that missed nothing. He looked at her without a word, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind sighing across the yard. Pete finally spoke. "Mrs. Sullivan's here about the cook's position." Jake's gaze never wavered. "You ever cook for 15 hungry men, Mrs. Sullivan?" "No, sir," she answered honestly, "but I'm willing to learn. This isn't a schoolhouse," he said. "I need someone who can do the job, not just promise to try." Margaret met his eyes. "Then why has the position been open for 2 months?" Something flickered in those gray eyes. "Surprise, maybe respect." "Because most folks are smart enough to know better," he said finally. "You'll get a week to prove you can handle it." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "One more thing, Mrs. Sullivan." The last cook never smiled. "Made the whole house heavy, so if you're staying, you'd better season your cooking with laughter, too." Margaret blinked, unsure if he was serious. "Laughter, Mr. Caldwell." He nodded slightly. "Out here, food keeps the body alive. Laughter keeps the soul from dying. You can start tonight. Dinner's at 6. And with that, the door closed behind him, leaving Margaret staring after him, the dust swirling around her boots, not knowing yet that his challenge would change both their lives forever. The kitchen of the Circle M ranch looked more like a blacksmith's forge than a place meant for food. A hulking cast-iron stove crouched against one wall, its metal sides streaked with soot. A barrel of water stood near the door, and the shelves held flour sacks, beans, and jars of preserved meat. Margaret took it all in with a deep breath. It was her new world. She set down her bags and rolled up her sleeves. The firebox was half full of ash. It took 3 matches, a good deal of kindling, and some language that would have shocked her church friends back in Philadelphia before a flame finally caught. By the time the stove roared to life, her forehead glistened with sweat. She found onions, potatoes, and a hunk of salted beef in the pantry and decided a stew was safest. How hard could it be? But the knives were dull, the pot heavy, and the stove burned hotter than the fires of judgment. By the 3rd hour, her stew smelled scorched, and the biscuits she'd dared to attempt were more like stones. "You look like you're fighting a bear, ma'am." Margaret whirled to see a young cowboy in the doorway, hat in hand and freckles bright on his sunburned nose. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said quickly. "Name's Tom Bradley. Mr. Caldwell sent me to bring in more firewood." Margaret let out a breath. "Thank you, Tom." "And tell me," "What do these men usually like for dinner?" he grinned. "Anything hot that don't bite back. Cowboys ain't too fussy, though, Jake. Mr. Caldwell. He's got more refined taste than most. Guess he was raised proper once Margaret stirred the stew." "Proper?" Mr. Caldwell Tom nodded. "So they say. Texas family. Schooling. Maybe even college. Never talks about it, though. Just runs this place like it's his whole world." When Tom left, she tasted the stew. Too bland. She threw in more salt, some pepper, and prayed it would pass. By sunset, the dinner bell clanged and 15 dusty men filed in, filling the kitchen with the smell of leather and horse. They nodded politely, but looked at the food like it might bite them first. Jake entered last. He took the seat at the head of the table, gray eyes sweeping over the room. Then, over her gentleman, he said, "This is Mrs. Sullivan. Mind your manners." The men dug in. The clatter of spoons echoed through the room, but no one spoke. Margaret watched anxiously. When the last bowl was empty, Jake rose Mrs. Sullivan. A word. Her heart sank as she followed him onto the back porch. The evening air was cool, the prairie glowing orange with the setting sun. The stew was under-seasoned. He said bluntly, "The biscuits could dent a horseshoe. And the coffee, well, we could use it to strip paint." Margaret opened her mouth to apologize, but he held up a hand. "But, he continued, "you kept going, didn't give up. You asked for help. That shows sense. You'll get your week like I promised." Relief made her knees weak. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," he nodded. "One more thing. You said you were willing to learn. I hope that means more than recipes." "I don't understand." "This life," he said, looking out over the darkening land, "it'll break you if you let it, not because of the work, but because of the silence. The emptiness. My last cook filled the kitchen with complaints and gloom until every meal tasted like misery. So if you're going to stay, Mrs. Sullivan, learn to laugh. The men need it. Maybe I do too." He left her standing there, the wind tugging at her dress. For a long moment she stared at the horizon, realizing this was about more than food. The next morning proved even harder. She woke before dawn, stumbled to the stove, and managed to burn the biscuits to charcoal. The coffee boiled over, coating everything in black grit, and she knocked over the milk pail in panic. The mess was complete when Jake stepped into the kitchen. "Language, Mrs. Sullivan?" he asked dryly, as smoke curled from the oven. She turned, mortified. "I set the dampers wrong, and then everything went wrong." He surveyed the chaos, then, to her surprise, rolled up his sleeves. "Watch and learn. When you bake, keep the dampers half closed. Bank the coals here. Like this." He worked with easy skill, his movements sure and practiced. "You've done this before," Margaret said. He shrugged. "Sometimes a man learns when no one else is around to do it." He nodded toward the flour bin. "We'll make pancakes." Faster and harder to ruin. Together they worked in unexpected rhythm. She mixed batter while he managed the fire. When Tom appeared, Jake handed him a skillet eggs, Bradley. "If you can cook them without burning, you get extra coffee." By the time the cowboys filed in, breakfast smelled heavenly. Pancakes, bacon, and eggs. No one mentioned the early smoke. They ate in contented silence. When the kitchen quieted, Margaret began scrubbing dishes. Her back ached, her hands were red, but she refused to feel defeated. Then Jake returned, setting something on the table. It was an old, stained cookbook, my mother's, he said. She used it when she first came west. The recipes are simple but good. You might find it useful. Margaret turned the pages reverently, seeing faded notes in a woman's neat handwriting. Your mother lived on a ranch. A small one near San Antonio, Jake said. She used to say the stove nearly beat her the first year. But she learned, even came to love it. His gaze softened for a moment. She was killed in a raid while I was away at college. I'm sorry? Margaret said quietly. He nodded once. She'd like that her book's being used again. Take care of it. After he left, Margaret traced one faded note in the margin. Jake's favorite, extra cinnamon. The words made her smile. Later that morning, shouts echoed outside. Through the window, she saw a cluster of riders gathered around someone on the ground. She hurried out. Tom lay in the dirt, face white, clutching his arm. "Horse through him!" One cowboy said. "Bring him inside," Margaret ordered. Her voice was steady now, all fear gone. They carried him to the kitchen table. Margaret examined the arm, felt the sharp bend beneath the skin. "It's broken, but clean. I can set it." "You know how?" Jake asked, appearing in the doorway. "My husband was a doctor." She said simply, "I often helped him." She gave quick orders: boards for splints, clean cloth, and someone to hold him. Jake took position behind Tom, gripping the young man's shoulders. "Do it," he said. Margaret pulled sharply, straightened the bone, and bound the arm tight. Tom yelled, then sagged, breathing hard. "There," she said. "He'll heal fine if he keeps it still." Jake watched her, something unreadable in his eyes. "You've got steady hands, Mrs. Sullivan. Not many would have done that." "When you live with a man who drinks," she said before she could stop herself, "you learn to handle things when he cannot." Silence filled the kitchen. She bent over the bandage, embarrassed by the confession. Jake's voice was quiet. "Then we're all lucky your husband's weakness taught you strength." He left after a moment, but before the door closed, he added, "Page 47 in that cookbook. Apple pie. The men haven't had one in months. Might lift their spirits, and mine." That night, Margaret baked her first pie. The crust was uneven, the filling too sweet, but when she set it on the table after dinner, the cowboys cheered like boys at Christmas pie. Tom shouted with his good arm, "Ma'am, you keep this up, we'll never let you leave." Jake took a bite, his expression softening. "Not bad, Mrs. Sullivan. Not bad at all." The men laughed, the room warm with food and noise. Margaret stood by the stove, flour on her cheek and a smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a widow chasing survival. She felt alive. Part of something again. Jake lingered at the door as the men drifted out. "My mother used to say," he said quietly, "a kitchen without laughter is just a room with a stove." Tonight felt like a kitchen again. He tipped his hat and left, leaving Margaret alone with the scent of cinnamon, the crackle of fire, and the faintest hum of hope in her heart. Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know. The weeks rolled by like a steady stream. October melted into November, and the Circle M Ranch began to change in quiet ways. The kitchen that had once been cold and still now carried the sounds of life. Laughter, clinking dishes, music from the bunkhouse drifting through open windows. Margaret's curtains fluttered in the breeze, hand-stitched from an old checkered tablecloth. Dried mint hung from the rafters, filling the room with a faint, clean scent. Tom, arms still in a sling, came early most mornings to sit at the table and talk while she cooked. "Smells like home in here," he said one chilly dawn. "Feels like it too," Margaret smiled as she kneaded bread. "Then we're doing something right." Quote, "When Jake stepped in, dusted from the range, his eyes flicked over the bright kitchen, the flowers in a jar, the warmth. Something softened in his expression. This place used to echo," he said quietly. "Now it hums." She handed him a mug of coffee. "Every home needs a hum, Mr. Caldwell." "Jake," he corrected, and she caught the faintest smile tugging at his lips. He'd grown easier around her since that first burned breakfast. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, he sat by the stove while she sewed, or read his mother's cookbook aloud. They spoke little, but the silence between them had changed. It felt companionable now, not lonely. Then, one crisp morning, he appeared in the doorway, a folded notice in his hand. "There's a harvest dance in town next Saturday," he said. "The men are going. You should too." Margaret froze mid-stir. "I haven't been to a dance in years." "Then it's time," he said simply. "You've been working non-stop since you came here. You deserve one evening that isn't about cooking." "I don't have a dress." He hesitated, then placed a brown paper bundle on the table. "This was my mother's." "Might need a few stitches." Before she could thank him, he'd tipped his hat and gone. That night she opened the bundle to find a deep blue wool dress, plain but fine, the sort a rancher's wife might have worn to church. She pressed it carefully, sewing by lamplight. The fabric carried the faint scent of cedar, and as she worked, she wondered what Jake's mother had been like, a woman who taught him about laughter, yet left him living in silence. When the night of the dance came, the sky glittered with stars sharp as glass. Margaret rode into town beside Jake, her heart thudding harder than it had since girlhood. Inside the hall, lanterns glowed, music filled the air, and people turned to watch them enter. She caught whispers, "That's the widow from Philadelphia. That's Caldwell's new cook." But she lifted her chin and smiled anyway. The evening passed in a whirl of reels and laughter. She danced twice with a young cowboy who stepped on her toes, then escaped to the refreshment table for air. "You survived," Jake said, appearing beside her with a glass of lemonade. "Barely." The music shifted to a slow waltz. Jake hesitated, then offered his hand. "Would you? Are you asking me to dance, Mr. Caldwell?" Quote, "I'm suggesting that if you happen to be on the floor, and I happen to be there too." "Enough happenstance," she said, smiling. "Yes." When his hand settled at her waist, the world quieted. Jake moved with the easy grace of a man who'd learned long ago but hadn't forgotten. They didn't speak as they turned under the lamplight. The scent of pine and wood smoke drifted in from outside. "You dance well for a cowboy," she murmured. He met her eyes, "And you, for a cook." After the song ended, neither moved away. For a long heartbeat, the noise of the crowd faded, and it was only them. Two people who had lost too much and finally dared to reach for something new. The next week brought a storm that tested everyone. Dark clouds rolled across the prairie, and by afternoon the wind screamed around the house. Most of the men were still out with the cattle. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching the sky turn the color of gunmetal. "Looks bad," Tom said, limping in. "Jake's still out there." "Then, we keep the lamps burning," she said firmly. "He'll need to see the way home." Rain came in sheets, drumming the roof. Lightning split the sky. One by one, soaked riders staggered through the door, until only Jake and two others were missing. Margaret filled the stove with wood, kept stew simmering, coffee hot. Every man she fed, every wound she wrapped, every word of calm she offered, felt like a prayer. When the last rider burst in near midnight, Jake among them, mud-covered and half-frozen, she barely breathed until he spoke, all accounted for. She pressed a mug of coffee into his shaking hands. "You need rest." "So do you." They stared at each other through the steam. Around them, the exhausted men slept on the floor, the storm still howling outside. "You kept them fed and warm," he said softly. "You kept hope alive. You did more than any man here tonight." "I just cooked," she murmured. He shook his head. "You built a haven." He swayed slightly, and she caught his arm, steadying him. "Come, sit before you fall." He obeyed, slumping onto the bench. "Margaret," he said, voice rough, "I asked you to season with laughter." "I didn't realize you'd bring light too." Her throat tightened. "Then, I've done my job. More than that." His gray eyes held hers, warm despite the fatigue. "You've changed this place. You've changed me." Quote. She wanted to answer, but words tangled with emotion. Instead, she laid her hand over his. "Then rest, Jake. Tomorrow will come soon enough." He smiled faintly. "You'll still be here tomorrow." "I will." Morning broke clear and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the ranch washed clean. The men stirred, stiff and sore but alive. Margaret brewed coffee and baked fresh biscuits while sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. When Jake appeared, freshly shaved, the quiet joy on his face said everything. Weeks later, after repairs and rebuilding, he found her in the kitchen once more, humming as she worked. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, "we need to discuss your position." Her heart faltered. "Of course. If my work isn't." "It's been perfect," he interrupted better than I could have hoped. But there's another position open here, one that doesn't come with wages. He reached into his pocket and placed a small box on the table. Inside lay a simple gold ring with a blue stone. For a moment she couldn't breathe. "I'd like you to stay," he said quietly, "not as my cook, but as my wife. You've brought laughter back to this house. I don't ever want to lose it again." Tears blurred her vision. "Jake, I came here with nothing." He took her hands. "You brought everything that mattered." She laughed softly, trembling. "Then I suppose I'll have to keep my promise, to season our life with laughter. Every day," he said. "That's all I'll ever ask." And there, in the kitchen that had once been a lonely man's refuge, beneath sunlight that poured across the scarred wooden table, Margaret said yes. Later, when the cowboys crowded the doorway, cheering and clapping, Jake just smiled and pulled her close. "Told you laughter was the secret ingredient." Margaret looked up at him, eyes shining. "And you were right. Outside, the wind swept across the wide Texas prairie, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and wildflowers. And inside the Circle M, a widow and a cowboy began their new life, proving that even in the hardest land, hope could still take root if only you seasoned it with love and laughter."